Hello and welcome back to the Little Craft House. If we haven't met before, my name is Nicole and I like to show you guys how to make polymer clay and resin jewelry. So usually I'm doing the tutorials for the jewelry making side of things. Today, however, I'm going to be showing you how I made some silicone molds. So I made a whole bunch of silicone molds ready to do a bit of a Christmas release with my earrings. So I wanted some new and unique designs to create with. So yeah, I thought I'd make the molds and I thought I would bring you guys along with me today to show you how I made them. Since I made them, I have used them, so these ones are now a little bit dirty. That will be sort of a part 2 to this tutorial. So this week I'm going to show you how I made the molds, and next week I'll show you how I used them and the jewelry pieces that I made with them. So yeah, if you're interested in seeing that, don't forget to come back next week and watch that one as well. So these silicone molds are super quick and fun to make. All up, it took me about an hour to make these, and then I just had to wait for them to cure, which took about 3 to 4 hours. Now, I've made these obviously to use for my resin jewelry making. You can also use them for your polymer clay jewelry making. And if you're a cake decorator, you can get food safe silicone as well, which you're able to use for your fondants and icing. So even though this tutorial is for my resin pieces, if you use a different sort of medium, it is also applicable for those, and you can make things for those as well. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to show you how I did it. So yeah, stick around and let's get into it. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is gather our supplies. So I've got my liquid silicone here, which is a product from Just Resin. It's called Artsil, and it's a 2-part liquid silicone. I also have a whole bunch of pieces, which I like to refer to as blanks, and these are what I'm going to be using to set into the liquid silicone to make the shapes within the molds. So your choices are pretty endless for what you can cast, but for me, I prefer anything that's got a flat side. These candy canes here were from a pair of earrings that I had made previously out of acrylic, so they're going to hopefully work really well. I've also got some blanks here, which are from one of the sets that we sell in our store. So yeah, I prefer anything that's just got a flat side on it. I find it easier to cast. You'll see why afterwards as we prepare our molds. Anything with a glossy top also is something that I prefer, because when you make your molds, the liquid silicone is going to take on every single detail. So you want to make sure that your blanks are in really good condition and that they're not scratched up or dented or anything, because yeah, every little bit of detail will be taken on. So apart from things that are made from acrylic, you do have quite a few different options of what you can cast. So in the past, I've done buttons, I've done different parts from earring components. I've also made blanks as well using my polymer clay. So some of the earring pieces that I've made with, if I've got a cool cutter shape and I want to reproduce those but in resin, I've made the blanks out of the polymer clay. I've domed them with resin so that they're nice and shiny and pretty perfect on top, and then I've been able to use them to cast as well. So you can use your imagination. There is lots of things around that you can cast. So just see what you've got and yeah, what you want to be able to reproduce. Now, even though I'm doing some Christmas themes, I thought I would just look for some hollow shapes here, just because I've got a few little bits of glitters and things that will be Christmassy, but I don't necessarily need them to be in the Christmas shape. So I've gone with some of those hollows. I also have an idea to do a Christmas wreath. I'm not 100% sure if that will work, but I will find some components for that too. I just needed like a hollow circle, and I have some little bows which came with a thing that my daughter's got, that I'm going to try and cast those as well, and then we'll see how that goes for making some wreaths. That will be in next week's tutorial anyway, if that works out, so we'll see how that goes. So once you've settled on all the pieces that you're going to be using, you need to make sure that any of those blanks have their plastic covers peeled, so I'll need to do that and give them a quick little wipe down as well. Now here I have a bunch of my surrounds. So this is what's going to contain the liquid silicone so it doesn't run all over the place. Lots of different options. The little black circles are egg rings, which I just got from the supermarket. I've got some laser cut ones here as well that we sell in the store, as well as a 3D printed one. That there is some book contact, so just your clear book covering. I also have Lego. I don't use Lego in today's tutorial, but Lego works really well if you've got larger pieces that you want to get a specific mold size for. Now, plastic cup, pop sticks for stirring, I've got gloves, I've got wipes. I think that is all of my supplies that I need. The liquid silicone, as I mentioned before, is Artsil. So I'm just going to try and use up what's left in those other containers first, and then I'm going to move on to these new ones. It is a very simple 1-to-1 ratio. And what I really like best about this liquid silicone is when it's mixed well and mixed properly, it turns purple because you've got your pink and your blue, so it will turn nicely into a purple colour. So that's what I like about the Artsil. We also have a 45-minute work time with Artsil as well. Some of the other liquid silicones that I've used in the past have a very quick work time, but they also have a very quick set time. So today's one is about 45 minutes for work time, and then up to 2 to 5 hours for setting. Right, so I'm going to start organising my blanks into these mould surrounds to work out what I'm going to be doing. I like to just do this first before I start getting everything, definitely before I mix up the silicone, because once you've mixed it, you need to start using it. But I just want to make sure that I'm filling or choosing the right size frame for the pieces that I'm using. Obviously, we don't want to use a massive frame and only put like one small item in it, because then we're just wasting our liquid silicone. So I'm just trying to work out what is going to fit best into each of these shapes before we actually make or start making the molds. Another thing to consider when placing our blanks into the mold frames as well is that we don't want to have them too close or touching. So we want to have a nice gap around without being too much of a gap. It just makes it easier for pouring the liquid silicone in because it's quite thick. So if you only have small gaps in between, it can be a little bit tricky and you risk getting air bubbles. And I really do like using the egg rings as my surrounds, but the only problem is they are a little bit on the small side. So a lot of my main feature dangle pieces are too big to fit in. So that's where I'll use the other surrounds usually, or if it's a particularly large piece that I'm going to be doing, then I will use the Lego to build up around. I do prefer to do lots of smaller molds though, rather than one large mold, just in case anything goes wrong, just in case any air bubbles form. I would prefer just to have lots of smaller molds. That way as well, I don't have to be using all the designs all in the same time. So yeah, I just find it more handy to have lots of smaller molds rather than one large one. Once I'm happy with how I've positioned all the blanks within each of these mold frames, it's time to actually prepare the mold frames. So the book contact, the book covering that I was talking about earlier, this is a really good cheap way to make our bases for the molds. So I'm just cutting off a big sheet worth here, and we'll cut it down to being just slightly larger than each of these mold frames. So it don't do it too small. It's good to have a little bit overlapping. Because it is clear and it is very sticky, it serves a couple of purposes. So we're going to stick our blanks onto the clear stickiness in just a moment. The fact that it's clear can come in handy if you want to set, if you want to make these on, say, like a plastic tub lid or something. You're able to then lift it up, look up from the underneath and see if you've got any air bubbles trapped. Sometimes I'll do that. I'm kind of used to it a bit more now. I used to do that a lot more in the beginning when I first started making the molds, but now I kind of trust the process, and I think I'm okay with the avoiding bubbles. Okay, so here I'll just show you how I'm going to do it. So I'll just pull off that protective cover. I probably should have just pulled it off the full way. I didn't want it to flip back up, so this is a little bit awkward. But yeah, just get that mold frame, and it bubbled. Not a good example, but you get the point. So we're going to push the mold frame down on it anyway to create a seal so that our liquid silicone can't escape. Now, if you were going to do a larger, deeper mold, and when I use Lego, sometimes I'll do it. I'll grab the hot glue gun and go around the edge just to secure it, making sure that there's no gaps for the silicone to leak out. But if I'm just doing shallow ones, I find that the silicone's quite thick anyway. It doesn't really run out. So I've not really had any issues. Maybe when I was beginning I did, but not recently. So if you do want to give it an added support around the edge, then add some hot glue, but if not, don't stress about it too much. Right, so I'm laying down my blanks onto the contact sheet, making sure that they are pressed down nice and firmly. The contact sheet will be the top of the mold, so we're working upside down. So we're going to, any details and things you want to be facing into the mold, so you want that facing up, you want the flat side flat on the bottom there. So I'm just trying to make sure my spacing is right before I put them down, because I don't want to break that seal and the stickiness once I've placed them in. And it is really important to get that nice, good, solid bond between your pieces and that contact on the bottom, just so that we don't get any of the liquid silicone leak underneath. And that's why I mentioned earlier about having flat pieces. That's why I prefer the flat pieces, anything that's not quite flat. So sometimes with my polymer clay and things, if I'm using them as a blank, if they're not super flat on the bottom, you get a little bit of leakage, which makes the tops of our molds a little bit messy. But it's fixable, and I'll show you how I fix that later. Now, it does help to have super sharp scissors. That pair was super blunt, so I don't know what was going on there. Don't know where I pulled them from. Anyway, I'm just going to speed up this now as I'm making the rest of the molds. If you do have any questions about this mold making process, pop it in the comment section and I will try and get back to you about that. And here I'm onto my candy cane mold. Now, one pair of these candy canes was from a pair of earrings that I took back apart, which I'd made last Christmas, didn't sell them. Well, they might have been mine actually. I took them apart to remake the mold. The other pair I already had in my molds box, so I think I may have made a mold out of, or intended to make a mold last year. Anyway, spoiler alert, that mold ends up being a bit of a fail, because the pair that was in the bag that I pulled out earlier, not the pair from the made earrings, had its plastic protective covering on it from the acrylic. So when I've pushed it down onto that sticky base, the acrylic hasn't stuck down onto the base, that clear plastic sheet did, and so I end up with a bit of spillage happening. The liquid silicone runs underneath of the candy cane. I'll show you what happens later and how I clean it up, but it is a bit of a fail, and yeah, mistakes happen. So even though I've done this a million times and I should have known to check for a cover, yeah, I forgot. But that's what I'm doing here with these little elf hats. They had a plastic covering on them, so I've taken that off, which is what you're supposed to do. Okay, so now that I've got all of that prepped, it is now time to mix together my liquid silicone. So as I mentioned before, I want as much work time with the liquid silicone as possible because we need to eradicate any bubbles that occur. So we want as long as we can. So I'm just going to start now. I'm going to mix it now that I have prepared everything. And so as I mentioned before, this one is a really simple 1-to-1 mix. So I've done 100 mils of the pink and 100 mils of the blue so that I'll get 200 mils of the liquid silicone. It probably isn't going to be enough to do all my molds, but I'll just do the smaller quantities to start with. So in the intro, I mentioned about being able to do silicone molds for the use with food as well. It's not something that I've done before, like I've only ever used it for my polymer clay or for the resin. But in case you're wondering, the Just Resin Art Sil does have an FDA approved food safe rating. And it also says that it is food grade, food safe. So this one I'm sure you'd be able to use for food, but if you are going to use it, just double check those standards anyway. But yeah, this one is food rated according to the back of the bottle. And also one more thing that is really good about this brand as well, and just to let me put it out there, I'm not sponsored by this brand, but this is one that I do like using. Another reason is that it's got heat resistance of up to 250 degrees Celsius as well. So even though I don't bake my polymer clay in the molds, if I happen to do one which did require baking within, or if I wanted to use liquid silicone, liquid polymer clay in the molds, then I'd be able to do that and bake it in the oven as well because it's heat rated to go in the oven. Okay, so that is all measured out now. The blue component is obviously heavier than the pink because it's kind of settled down into the pink, which means that it has already started its chemical reaction into making it into the liquid silicone. So time has already started, time is already ticking, so I need to get stirring. So I'm just using my popsicle stick and going not too fast. It is quite thick, so I do need to put a little bit of pressure into it, but I don't want to add any bubbles into, well, I want to avoid adding bubbles into it. So just giving it a really good mix, not forgetting to scrape down around the edges and also scraping off the popsicle stick as I go. And as I mentioned before, you can tell when it's well mixed because the colour changes. So yeah, just scraping down the edges there. Yeah, the colours change. So I've used other ones before that the colour doesn't change, and it does make it quite hard to tell when you've got your mixture stirred completely and ready. But yeah, so I'm just giving it a good stir, and then once it is all nice and purple, it'll be ready to use. Okay, so I ended up editing this stirring process down a little bit, but I probably mixed for about 5 minutes all up, just making sure that it was nicely mixed up. If you're working with one of the quicker setting ones, like a pinky sil or a transil, you'll notice it start to thicken up and you'll know that you need to get ready to start using. Because this one's got the 40-minute, 45-minute work time. At the moment it's not thickening up, but as it starts to hit that point, you will feel that it starts to thicken, and that's when you know that you need to hurry up. So you can see that there's a couple of bubbles have started to come to the surface. I'm just going to give it a bit of a tap, try and surface some bubbles before I start pouring. So I will just let it sit for just a moment while I bring over all my molds and get them all ready. And this will just help to get some of the bubbles out first. It's pretty good though. It doesn't really attract a lot of bubbles into the mixture, but bubbles are not our friend. If we end up with bubbles in our mold, it means that they will actually be holes within the mold, and that means that when you then pour your resin or whatever liquids you're pouring in, will obviously fill the hole, and then yeah, it will just ruin your paste. So I've got this little air blower here. It's actually from my alcohol ink set, but that comes in really handy for blowing the bubbles and popping them. So you could use a straw or just have something to just manually pop them with, but I do like that air blower. I find that really helpful to have on hand. So when it comes to the pouring part, I'm just going to really slowly go around the edges of each of my pieces. I'm going to do this sort of in sections, I suppose. I want to make sure that the silicone goes around the edges nice and evenly without any trapped bubbles. So not worried about filling the whole thing at the moment. I just want to get around the edges. And if you've got any pieces that have the holes pre-drilled in them, so if they were earring components, which some of these ones were, just making sure that that silicone's on the top there, giving it a chance to drip down into those holes and fill any bits, any of those details as well. And then I'm going to go along with the air blower and I'm just going to give it a blow. It's going to pop any bubbles that have surfaced, but it's also going to slightly move that silicone as well. And by moving it around will also help it to fall down into those detailed areas. I'm working on the kitchen bench today, so I can't create a vibration to help the air bubble surface, but if I work on a tray or on a container lid like I mentioned earlier, you can get a bit of a vibration going, and that will also help to rise any bubbles and give you the ability to pop them. And once I've given that a moment just to settle and for the liquid silicone to fill any of those little gaps, I'm now going to go back over and fill up any of the other gaps that are left and make sure that I go over the tops of each of these pieces as well. The liquid silicone is quite good at self-leveling. As you can tell, it's kind of just leveling itself out. I'm working on the kitchen bench because it is a nice flat surface. I'm just going to give it that little bit of a shake there just to make sure that it is nice and level and flat. We obviously want the top of the mold to be nice and flat because that will eventually be the bottom of our mold. So we don't want it to be lumpy or bumpy, because when we pour into it, it will mean that we don't have well, they'll be on a bit of an angle and it's not going to pour nicely. My shadow just blocked there, but you did see that there was a bunch of bubbles that had surfaced. So I'm just going to give it a good little blow over at the moment to pop those bubbles. And then afterwards, once I've let it set for a while, I will go back over and give it another blow as well before the silicone starts to fully harden. So I'm going to move that one out the way and we're going to go on with our next mold here. So with the elf hat, that's a little bit more detailed. You can see how the top of his hat kind of curls around. So there is that little bit of a gap where the curl is. There's also those little details around the base of his hat where it comes up on the edge at the sides. So needing to make sure that that silicone gets in all of those little gaps properly and fills them so that they're not going to be holes in our final piece. The stars are pretty simple. They're nice and rounded and quite a big shape, so I'm not worried about those. It's more those hats that I'm worried about. Right, so now I'm pouring the candy canes. Now they have lots of gaps in them, so I am just making sure that each of those gaps got some silicone into it, and I'm actually coming to the end of what's in this cup. So that's okay, I can do a multi-pour, that's not an issue. I'm just gonna make sure that I scrape this cup out completely though and get as much as I possibly can out. This is where it gets a little bit messy because now time has passed a bit as well. It's starting to thicken up a little bit as well. So it's a little bit harder to work with as it's starting to thicken. It's getting quite stringy. Now, one of the benefits of this liquid silicone is that it's actually really easy to clean up, but once it's set. I don't try and clean up anything whilst it's still wet, but once it sets, you're able to just sort of pull it off anything that's shiny. So any drips that I've got there on my kitchen bench, I'm able to just peel off. The cup will literally just, all the extra will just peel out. It will peel off the popsicle stick. And I just wear the gloves so that I keep my hands clean, really. But yeah, otherwise everything is just a really simple clean up, but you do have to just let it set first. If you try and clean it up whilst it's still wet, it's a lot harder. Just leave it till it's dry and cured, and then just peel it all off of everything. So that actually went a little bit further than what I thought it would in this mold. But if you ever run out of liquid silicone and you need to do a second pour, you can either wait for it to cure and then add more to it afterwards, or you can just wait until it's, or whilst it's still runny, and then you can add more to it, which is what I ended up doing here. I just mixed up a second cupful, and then here I'm just finishing off the last couple of molds. Sometimes I'll have a mold on the go for a while, so I'll just use any of the leftover bits of silicone and put it into a mold frame that just has some like floral flower pieces in it. I've got a couple of molds like that where I've actually used a few different brands, and so it's just the leftover bits because I don't want to waste anything, and I'll just add it in and then put it back in the cupboard once it's set, and then next time I mix up a cup full and have some spare, I'll just add the spare onto the top of it, let that cure, and yeah, so it's a bit of a work in progress, but it's a way to avoid wasting any scraps as well, because you don't really want to overfill and end up with overflowing on these molds. Okay, so I filmed this bit in the wrong direction, but anyway, I've got them all sitting on my kitchen bench curing now, so I'm going to leave them as long as I can to cure before I move them or demold them. Yeah, cure time's between 2 and 5 hours, so usually I'll leave 3 to 4 hours and they're usually okay. I think because they're shallower, they don't take quite as long, but obviously the longer you can leave, the better. I've noticed an air bubble there, which is really annoying. And also I noticed that there's a dog hair in it. Good job these molds are just for me. I'll try and get it out, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to. Right, so I am back. It is now 1 p.m. and they're all feeling pretty set and ready to demold. I'm a little bit impatient, so I want to demold them anyway, even if they're not 100% set. So I didn't mention this morning that it took an hour from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock to make these molds, so it was pretty quick. The process of demolding, I am pulling off that clear contact first, and then you can see there's the molds. This is when I check my pieces. If there's any overflow, I try to just use my nail to scratch it off. Sometimes it's so thin that you're able to just give it a bit of a rub and it cleans up any of that overflow that's come underneath. Other times I do have to use a bit of a knife or something sharper to remove it. I do that first before popping it out of the frame, and then I'm going to pop each of these pieces out. So there we go, it came out super easy. That one, the little hole worked in it at the top there, same as that one, but I didn't clean it up properly. There we go, I just was able to pull off that little extra bit. It doesn't bother me if these holes didn't work, because I'm more than happy to drill holes in my pieces. So I wasn't too fussed about having those holes transfer through. Right, so here's a little bit stuck, there we go. It's a little bit messy on the edges there. And then I did these little triangular ones, oh perfect. Awesome, they all worked out pretty well. A little bit of cleanup that I've got to do, but pretty good I think for that one. Right, next one, let's have a look. Get that contact off. And they look like they've worked really well. Not much cleanup required on these ones.
I don't think it saves you any time because it stops you being able to go on to the 3-way.
And something I didn't mention earlier as well is I like the shiny glossy pieces to cast because it makes my mold shiny and glossy, which means the resin that I will cast will then be shiny and glossy too. If you do a matte finish, your pieces that you reproduce will become matte finish as well. Now the candy canes, this is what I was talking about earlier about the fail. Look how much it has spilled underneath the candy cane. You can see the difference between those two that look nice and bright and the other two where it's gone dull. And it wasn't until I was removing them that I realized that the plastic covering was still on them, and that is why it managed to soak underneath. So that was a little bit disappointing. I did try and clean them up, but two were definitely usable and fine. It's just the other two, a little bit debatable on those ones. Okay, these were the ones I was talking about earlier about wanting to do the wreath shapes. So I did find some hollow circles, and I also have some solid circles as well that I've done. And then in the middle is some bows, which was something that came with one of my daughter's things for cheerleading. So I was able to reproduce those, and they end up still being in perfect condition, so I can give them back to her for her little clip things that she has. So it didn't damage anything that I have cast here.
Adding a lunchtime 1-hour news bulletin. So you'll have
that's what I get too. That did spill a little bit on the outside, but I can clean that up as well. Right, so back to this one. Look how the spillage happened. I've brought it down into my craft room, and I'm going to use my knife, which isn't overly sharp. I must admit I need to change the blade on this, but I'm going to try and use the blade to cut some of that additional silicone off just to neaten it up. And I've left it in the frame because I want it to be as stable as possible, and I've left the pieces in whilst I work on it, and then afterwards I can take it all out and then work on it a little bit more. So I worked on it for a little while, probably longer than I would have liked to have worked on it. But you can definitely see how much I've cleaned it up for how it was. The edges are still a little bit not quite as crisp and clean as I would like. You can sort of, wait till I pop this one out and you can see the comparison. So I will try and cast some resin into these ones and see how they go. If they don't come out clean and as usable as I would like, then I just won't use those two on that side. I've grabbed my little sharp scissors here too. I'm just going to try and do a little bit of cutting, see again if I can neaten them up. I usually don't like to do this much tidying up on the molds, but obviously I do want to use the mold. So ideally we prep better, and so this doesn't happen, and yeah, then the cleanup isn't necessary. Right, so I realised that I haven't shown the final outcome of the moulds before I used them. So they are all a little bit dirty because I've used them now. As I mentioned earlier, the usage of these moulds making a range of Christmas earrings I have recorded and will be doing as a tutorial for next week. So if you are interested in seeing how I use them and the earrings that I've created, make sure you pop back on next week and check out that tutorial. So I'll just quickly show you that I did do a little bit of a cleanup on these before I used them. So they're all looking pretty good. Those candy canes, they didn't turn out too bad. I did end up with a bit of a fail from these two in the resin that I cast in them. So I probably won't use these two again, but these two from this side worked really well. So yeah, they're definitely a keeper, and then I'll probably just put a little mark next to these with a permanent marker just so that I know not to use those ones again. But otherwise they worked well. To say that there was only the two fails out of all of these shapes is pretty good. Yeah, these worked well as well in those little details. That was all good. And also I didn't show the bows earlier, but the bows also took on really good detail. There's a couple of little air bubbles got trapped in there, but I haven't cast those ones yet, but they will actually be okay, I think, because it just sort of adds to the detail. But yeah, the bows are going to go on the top of the circles to make some wreaths, and then I've got some other plans for the full circles. The dog hair's attached itself to this one. That's right, it's moving. I can clean it. But yeah, so these are the molds that I ended up making. So I hope that you guys enjoyed coming along with me whilst I made them. Hope you found that interesting, maybe learned something new, and maybe I've tempted you into making your own molds. So thanks for joining me today. Hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. And I'll see you next week with my resin earring tutorial using these molds. See you then. Bye.